Having the ability to inlay intricate pieces such as this wooden flower can really take your project to the next level with this eye-catching element. In today's episode, I'm going to show you how I did it using a plunge router and a couple of hand tools. Before I get started, I wanted to mention that this process really takes practice and a steady hand. As you will see, even though I practiced this inlay several times, I feel I can do a better job to eliminate all the gaps and cracks between the flower petals and the surface. With the base understanding of the process and a lot of practice, you can inlay pieces without the gaps, or at least know how to fix them. For the purposes of this demo, I'm using a small maple board as my sample surface. This board is too small to clamp down and still have room for the router to move, so I'm going to use double-sided carpet tape to hold it down. Carpet tape is very sticky stuff, and it did a great job of keeping the board in place. I wanted the flower inlay to be centered on the sample board, so I drew a line from corner to corner and lined the flower up with my marks. Now, since the flower is handmade, each petal is unique in shape, so I made a reference mark to help in lining it up once I route away the waste. To transfer the shape of the flower to the board, I first need to make sure that the flower doesn't move during this process. To hold it in place, I put a few small pieces of double-sided tape to the back side of the flower. Now, one important note about the tape is that it's not carpet tape, but instead Turner's tape. It's nowhere near as sticky as carpet tape because we obviously need to remove the flower without damaging it. And push it down. To begin transferring the shape, I'll start by using a marking knife to trace all the way around the flower. This will give me a crisp knife wall that will help me determine when I'm close enough with the router bit. After I scrap all the way around the flower, I then switch over to a 0.5mm pencil to darken my knife walls. Now I can very carefully remove the flower using a putty knife, and this is where using the carpet tape would have made this process difficult, if not impossible, without damaging the flower. To remove the waste, I'm using a plunge router with a 3/8 inch upcut spiral bit. To set the depth of the plunge, I first touch the bit to the surface and then I zero out the depth gauge. Next, I place a flower under the depth gauge and then lock it into place. The space that I just created is now the amount that the bit will plunge into the wood. Now that I've shown you how to make the depth so that the flower is flush, I actually set the depth of the bit so that the flower is slightly proud of the surface. I use a 1/16 of an inch shim as my guide. I do this because it's easier to sand away the extra surface of the flower versus having to plane down the whole board to the surface of the flower. To begin, I route away the waste in the center of the flower, leaving the little valleys where the petals end. I focus on those last after I remove the waste. It's important to take your time with the router. All it takes is one extra nudge and you remove too much waste, thus creating gaps. Now I can focus on removing the waste around the tips of the petals. Since I scribed around the flower with the marking knife, you will actually see the fuzzy grain pop off when you get right up to the knife wall. When that happens, don't remove any more waste from that area. Now, unfortunately, not all of the fuzzy wood fibers caused by the upcut spiral bit will pop off. It's possible that I didn't scribe deep enough with my marking knife, so to remove them, I lightly sand the edges, making sure not to round them over. This helps clear away the debris so I can see what I need to remove. With the path clear, I can go back for a second routing job to get close to my line. Even though it looks like all of my waste is gone, the flower is still too large for the opening. That means it's back to marking around the flower to see what waste I need to remove. It's important to note that I won't remove any of the pencil lead from the surface. I route up to that line. Routing inlay is a slow process which will require patience. Even after the second round of routing, it's still a little too tight. This is where hand tools come into play. I make a few marks on the surface to show where it's tight, and then I use my 1/4 inch chisel, kind of like a scraper, to remove the waste. I make a few swipes between the lines I drew until enough waste has been removed for the flower to finally be seated. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, practice really makes perfect. I took my time routing but still ended up with a couple of hairline gaps that will need to be fixed. Luckily it's simple. A little bit of sawdust mixed with glue should create a perfect filler to fill the gaps. So the question you'll have is, do you sand the flower or do you sand the board to get the dust for the filler? I opted to sand the board to get the sawdust because I don't want to change the shape of the flower, and if I sand the flower to get the dust, the wood filler will match the flower, which will change the shape of the tip of the petal. With enough sawdust collected, I'm ready to start the glue up. To apply even pressure to the flour, I used a scrapped MDF caul. I put tape on one side to prevent any glue squeeze out from getting on the MDF, which may cause it to stick to the flour. Before clamping the flour into place, I put a few drops of wood glue in my sawdust to create the filler. I filled the gaps around the flour and then put the MDF caul in place with a couple of clamps. After about a couple of hours, I can remove the clamps and give the flour a good sanding with 120 grit to make it flush with the surface. I sand all the way up to 180 grit. The flours also have a brass disc that gets inlaid and glued to the center. I've seen examples of this brass disc with texture added to it and it looks awesome. To add texture to mine, I used what tools I had on hand, which wasn't a ball peen hammer. The only thing that I had that was sort of close was a tack hammer. I kept hammering the center of the disc until it became convex with light texture on both sides. I made sure the disc still set flat and didn't wobble, and if it did, I would hammer a little on the concave side until it wouldn't rock side to side. To inlay the disc, I just put an 1¼ inch Forstner bit in the drill press and drilled 3/32 of an inch deep into the center of the flour. For the purposes of this demo, I just used CA glue to glue the disc to the flour, but in a real project, I'll be using a 2-part epoxy. One final step to make the disc look better was to rub the surface with the maroon Scotch-Brite pad to add a little patina. I should also mention that it would have made more sense to do this before gluing it into the flour, but I forgot. Learn from my mistakes, right? And to get a better idea of what the flour looks like with the finish on it, I wiped on a few coats of shellac, and it looked awesome. Even though I've practiced this inlay technique several times, I still had gaps to deal with. When it comes to inlay work, practicing really does pay off. I can do a better job on my next inlay attempt, and I think the key is to integrate more hand tools and stop relying so much on the router to get me right up to my line. I've ordered a few carving gouges that are similar to the shape of the pedals, so I think that will get me closer to perfection, but in the end, it's about knowing how to fix your mistakes and know that the next time you inlay something, you're going to be better at it and will have less gaps to fill. I really hope you learned a thing or two from this video, and if you liked it, leave a comment and tell me. You didn't like it? Also, leave a comment to let me know. I'm always looking for ways to improve not only in woodworking, but here on YouTube as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next build video.